you doing? What is up? I want to know what some of your guys' favorite feuds are. What are some of your favorite feuds? It could be a sports team versus each other, Flames versus Oilers. It could be McDonald's versus Wendy's, Domino's versus Papa John's. What are some of your guys' favorite feuds? Let me know. I want to know. Put it down in the comments below. I don't have a favorite feud. Maybe you've had a feud in your life. Maybe you know what it feels like to be in a fight or a feud with somebody. But you guys, it's okay, because we're going to talk about that today. We're going to talk about some feuds. One of them seem like a big deal to us now, but when we look back at what happened, it feels like there was a great wall of division that was between us and them, or maybe even a great wall of division between your favorite characters. And maybe no one was willing to tear down that wall and to listen or to break down and have reconciliation. There's so many reasons for resentment that might get built in a relationship. Maybe it's with a family member or a friend or someone you hardly know, but relationships aren't always easy. We fight, we compare ourselves, we compete, and sometimes we stop talking to others. All of these things will eventually grow into a wall of separation in our relationships. And if we don't deal with them, then they can result in a relationship so broken that it seems impossible to put back together. This is the problem for many of us today, but it was also a problem for the early followers of Jesus too. I left off last week and look at the book of the Bible called Ephesians in chapter 2. But first, let's do a real quick recap about Ephesians. Ephesians was written by Paul, who was an early leader of the early church. You should also know that there was two groups of people that the early church was made up of, the Jews and the Gentiles. The Jews were God's chosen people who God used to tell his story, and that they gave us the Old Testament. The Bible tells us that Gentiles is a word of everyone who wasn't a Jew. So if you weren't a Jew back then you would have been a Gentile. Jews and Gentiles were not people who you'd often see hanging out or being together. For generations, they had big issues, differences of opinion that divided them greatly. They were in a feud that built up a wall between them. And when Jesus arrived and declared that everyone who was Jew and Gentile was invited into God's family, some of the Jews and Gentiles finally began to come together around the message of Jesus. But getting along wasn't exactly easy. Paul knew that the walls of separation couldn't exist between followers of Jesus if the church was going to survive. So if we look at Ephesians 2 verse 11 to 18, it's a little hard to understand. So let's do a quick summary of it. Paul, he's talking about the two walls here, a wall between the Jews and Gentiles that separated them, but there's another wall, the wall that separates all of us from God. This wall wasn't built on disagreements or misunderstandings, but the wall between us and God was built by us, our rebellion against God. Paul says that through Jesus, both of these walls can be broken down and knocked out. You might have heard the phrase that Jesus saves. You might have seen it at the church or on a poster, maybe on some graffiti within the city. But it kind of sounds weird, right? Well, the word saved means that Jesus rescued us from an eternity without God. This saved means that sin needs to be, we need to be saved from sin. This is what robs us from our connection with God. Sin is anything that we do that goes against God's purpose. Because of sin, every single one of us has been separated from God. But Paul isn't writing this letter to convince us that we need to do something about it, because Jesus did that. Jesus had the plan and he fixed it. Jesus fixed it through his death and resurrection. We can no longer be separated from God. Jesus took that first step towards us and he pulled down that wall that separated us from God and made it to be reconciled. In this chapter, Paul talks a lot about reconciliation. And what does it mean to be reconciled? First, Paul describes the way that Jesus tore down these walls in verse 14. Between the Jews and Gentiles and between us and God, it's incredible to see that Jesus did this for us. He broke down those walls. And it's not the end of the story. Jesus didn't just destroy any walls, but he created something new. He wanted us to be close to God. And when I think about reconciliation, I also now think about tables. When Jesus tore down the wall that separated us between God, he created a table to invite us to take a seat. Walls keep us separated, but tables let us see eye to eye. They let us have conversations. They let us have meals and invite others to come in and join us. Although we're separated from God and from each other, God made reconciliation possible for us through Jesus. We can make peace with others, but what does reconciliation with God have to do with how we get along with other people? Because of Jesus, we are reconciled with God. And because of Jesus, we can reconcile with others. We can do for others what God has done for us. In the early church, there were Jews and Gentiles. Both groups had traditions surrounding how they followed God, and it was easy for them to be swept up judging each other or disagreeing each other and being stubborn about their own perspectives. But Paul knew walls of division could keep God's family from thriving, and the same is true today. Just like God called the Jews and Gentiles to reconcile and to make peace with each other back then, God is calling us to reconcile and make peace with each other today. Just like God took the first step towards us, we can take the first step towards others. Just like Jesus tore down the walls that divided us from God, we can begin to tear down the walls that have been built between each other. Just like Jesus built a new way for us to connect with God, we can work to rebuild past relationships that were damaged. Why? Because we're part of God's family. And as God's family, we can do to others what God did for us. And so this week, I want to challenge you guys. I want you to start tearing down a wall and building a new table. Maybe you need to tear down a wall between you and God. Jesus has already made a way for you to come to him. And maybe you need to do some work to remove some obstacles in your way. This week, how do you need to humble yourself, ask for forgiveness, forgive others? How are you going to do that? Paul reminded the early church on how important it was for them to reconcile with each other, and that's so true for us today. The church is God's family, but if we want to act in God's family, we're going to need to tear down some walls. We're going to need to build some tables and do hard work of doing for others what God has done for us. And we thank Jesus that we can.